This conversation is part of the fall programming in conjunction to the exhibition Du Bois in Our Time, which will close on December 8th. I would like to thank Mass Humanities, the Interdisciplinary Studies Institute, the Massachusetts Cultural Council, and Five College Lecture Fund for their generous support this evening. We are coming almost to the end of the fall and the fall programming, but there are two more events that will take place. This coming Saturday at 2 p.m. at Pamusa in Springfield, we are going to have, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, we are going to have a conversation with Horace Ballard, Kelly Morgan, both PhD candidates, and Professor James Strickland. They are talking about Smithers.
I don't adopt people.
I'm so sorry. How many times have I said your names and this time I get it wrong? This is on African American art in the 20th century with highlights of the Harlem Renaissance, the Black Arts Movement, and current trends. Next Wednesday, a conversation about voices of protest with Professors Barbara Krauthammer in history, Nick Brommel of American Studies, and Preston Smith, Africana Studies from Mount Holyoke College. That talk will focus on social movements in the time of Du Bois and will give an overview of the social actors at the time. Du Bois was certainly not alone, and this is a conversation about that. Today's talk will conclude with a question and answer period, and afterwards, a group of Springfield educators will stay for a conversation of Du Bois's book, The Souls of Black Folks. They all read this, and anyone who would like to stay on for this conversation is certainly very welcome to do so. We will have a little break, and then we just shuffle the chairs around a little bit, and then we move on. Meanwhile, I would like to introduce you to the three speakers today, or the conversationalists today. Jason Irizarry is an associate professor and director of urban education here at UMass. He is teaching undergraduate and graduate courses in multicultural education, culturally responsive curriculum development, participatory action research, and urban education. His research includes urban teacher recruitment, preparation and retention with an emphasis on increasing the number of teachers of color, culturally responsive pedagogy, youth participatory action research, and Latino studies in US schools. A central focus of his works involves promoting the academic achievement of youth in urban schools by addressing issues associated with teacher education. Dr. Irizarry's research papers have been published in many journals and books. He recently was awarded the Philip Chin Book Award from the National Association for Multicultural Education. Then we have Bill Strickland, professor of political science at the W.E.B. Du Bois Department of African American Studies here at UMass. During the 60s, Dr. Strickland was executive director of the Northern Student Movement, worked in Ruralville, Mississippi for the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, and then returned north to be the Northern coordinator of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party's Congressional Challenge. He was a founding member of Malcolm X Organization of Afro-American Unity in 1964, and in 1969 was also a founding member of the Atlanta-based Institute of the Black World, the first independent black think tank of the modern era. Dr. Strickland was consultant to the documentary on the civil rights movement, Eyes on the Prize, and the PBS documentary Malcolm X, Make It Plain, to which he wrote the companion book. Most recently, Professor Strickland was a consultant on the Louis Massiah film on Du Bois, W.E.B. Du Bois, a biography of 4 voices. Last but not least, Christopher Tinson. He is Assistant Professor of the African American Studies Department at Hampshire College. His interdisciplinary research and teaching focuses on the intersections between Africana radical traditions, U.S. ethnic studies, hip-hop culture, critical media studies, incarceration, community-based education, and race and sports. His writings have been published in the Black Scholar, the Journal of African American History, The Nation, and Radical Teacher. He currently resides in Holyoke, Massachusetts, and has conducted workshops on various college campuses, high schools, and juvenile detention centers in the area, and serves as a youth mentor. Since 2006, he has hosted Trigger Radio, a hip-hop rooted social studies program. So welcome, the three of you, and I'm very much looking forward to your conversation. Thank you.
Great. Just for the record, Strick is the only expert up here. We're just practitioners, okay? Another word, practitioner, is bodyguard. All right, so that's what's up. But I'm honored, actually, and I said this on the radio last Friday, to be on a panel with both Jason, especially, and Strick, because you know, it's not often that you get a chance to work with people who kind of taught you, and you know, so Strick was one of those ones in grad school that really forced us to really take seriously, read closely, reflect often. Keep our mouth shut. And also, just a quick story, when Strick was teaching the seminar on Du Bois, while I was in grad school in the early 2000s, he could be found inspecting your own copy of Souls of Black Folk. So I was walking down the hall before class, and Strick was like, "Where's your book?" So I had it tucked in my back pocket, you know. He grabs it out of my back pocket and thumbs through the pages. So I think on some level that was like a violation of space, but we ain't gonna say, you know. But the point is that he wanted us to really engage fully the ideas coming from Du Bois, Souls of Black Folk, and many other writings that you will hear mentioned today. So first off, thank you one and all for attending, and also props to the W.B. Du Bois Afro-American Studies Department, of which I am a graduate, so it's it's an honorable moment for me to be here and work with you. So I'm gonna read, if that's okay. There'll be some points where I talk, and I tried to make this, you know, as direct as possible. But the title of this one is Du Bois and Critical Knowing, and I like to start with a story. When Du Bois learned of the recently increased bounty on Assata Shakur, he decided to withdraw Obama's invitation to the Pan-African Human Rights, Freedom, Justice, and Equality Forum, scheduled to take place the following month. True story. He thought inviting him in the first place would be an opportunity to knock the imperial designs from his world outlook. Robeson chuckled at the old man. Disinviting Prez wasn't a difficult decision exactly. He and the doctor had butted heads before while Barry was in law school. The final paper he written for Du Bois's Comedic Foundations of Jurisprudence, the course he taught every third spring, the one that Barry had just had to take before he graduated, was little more than the thinly veiled criticism of the We Charge Genocide petition. The funny thing is that the doctor had only read the first sentence of the 44-page essay before he was forced to pause and ponder the heavens. It began, "We hold these truths to be self-evident." Moreover, he was perturbed at noticing the bibliography hadn't included any of the supporting documents painstakingly selected and uploaded onto Moodle. Barry's cigarette in hand, cocksure attitude, defense of the framers will be an early straw destined for a desert camel's back. But the new Assata woman hunt almost sent the doctor back to a cry. As the news flashed across his Samsung Galaxy tablet, he shook his head and immediately summoned Lauryn Hill, who was feverishly on the final edits of her PhD thesis, for which she was still searching for a title but already had a publisher. She was elated that her committee had approved the proposed study just over a year ago. A Critical Diagnosis of Harriet Tubman's Freedom Strut, String Theory, The Book of Revelations, and Fanonian Revolutionary Psychoanalysis, Lacan be damned. She thought about calling it the miseducation of something, something like that. Her argument was that Harriet articulated the first intersectional analysis targeting the unraveling of Western epistemologies through examining the shallow, dysfunctional male chromosomes in white supremacist discourses. For Lauren, Harriet's calculus demonstrated that the length of the Euphrates divided by the number of perfection was close to equal the number of years between the arrival of 20 Africans who taught the Dutch how to parallel park their ship under City Hall and the end of the Civil War, plus or minus a couple of years, but I digress. Having recently returned from Zimbabwe, the doctor knew that Assata was safe, but since pages were still being added to his own FBI file, he knew that something was brewing. Without a Bloomberg coup d'etat, he knew that Barry couldn't run for a third term, so he was unable to surmise a justification for this recent hunt. He decided to respond by thoughtfully sending a kind note in his distinctive cursive that began, "Dear Mr. President, one ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, and something about a dark body ripped in two." From where I stood, it was hard to see the rest of it, but I'm still tripping on why he signed the letter, "Sincerely, Credo." Must be some kind of inside dig. Closing his pen, gently folding the note, he sealed it and slid it across his long mahogany desk and asked Brother Beethoven to deliver it first thing in the morning. The critical appreciation of Du Bois forces us to consider the weight and the ethics of democratic practice. I'm using democratic practice not in an effort to reinforce the notion that we are moving towards a more perfect union, but to simply make the point that the work of Du Bois explodes the very meaning of democracy as constituted under global racial capitalism. We would not be assembled here today were it not for Du Bois. What I mean by this is the following: with no disrespect to George Washington Williams, Schomburg, or Carter G. Woodson, there wouldn't be any Africana studies without Du Bois. That's the end of story in my book. We can close it right there. Everybody could go home. Of course, talking about the doctor is never easy nor finished. He has left us with the cavernous mines of knowledge, the minerals of which will be excavated for years to come. So it should delight us all to know that we will have to encounter his legacy for the remainder of our lives, the remainder of our children's lives, and their youngsters too. Scholars such as Raylan Rubaka, who was here earlier as a part of this event, and Anthony Montero, among many other black scholars, Du Boisian in their own ways. For them, Du Bois represents what's called an epistemic rupture. As Montero cautions, we must do more than simply cite Du Bois and append him to other more mainstream projects. Indeed, in grappling with Du Bois, it welcomes an attention to the particular linkages in his thinking, arriving at a fuller appreciation of his ideas. Building on the work of Anthony Bogues, we might acknowledge Du Bois as the ultimate embodiment of radical rupture. He is the very substance of the break, a breach, as it were, from the belief of foundational human knowledge emanating and ever referring back to white European discourses and definitions of the knowable. And yet the break must be repeatedly performed, targeting what Michelle Stevens has described as a global narrative of colonization, cultures of imperialism, and globalization that would emerge in the 20th century and continue to shape our world today. Yet in breaking apart of the self-referential European-derived regime of knowledge, the doctor also established the building blocks, scaffolding, and electricity that has gone into building something called Africana Studies. The outrageous notion that African people and descendants of diaspora would be able to teach the world anything about their own experiences, have their own ideas, possess their own minds. Go figure. And the mere assertion of that remains befallen on deaf ears, who would much rather transcend this earth with a liberal arts degree minus an engagement with the thinking, strategizing, wrestling, and demanding that emerges from the black world than to engage it on its own terms. Du Bois lay at the center of all educational projects concerning history and knowledge of the African world. Following Bogues, we might ask, at what point does rupture begin? Since we already briefly touched on the break, here we might think of rupture on the flip side, that is, as the creation of a philosophical, historical, cultural foundation for, about, and to the African diaspora, not in an effort to paralyze and stunt the growth and centering of diaspora knowledge, but to plant the seeds of its exponential expansion. That is to say, that the production of knowledge, the moments of rupture, is experienced wherever we reside, love, and pray. The ruptures embedded within Du Boisian knowledge contain the decentering and persistent undoing of Westernicity. Such establishes the agenda of an active socio-ethical uprooting for future environmental fertility. This, to me, seems to be the essence of the doctor's work. While we can point to moments of rupture in page after page of the doctor's oeuvre, the immortal child and the propaganda of history will serve our purposes for today. In the former, the social education of children of African descent takes center stage. Here, Du Bois is concerned with the social world they inhabit and inherit, the social education of racist custom, the pedagogy of white supremacy, in its profound ignorance and emptiness. He writes, in the treatment of the child, the world foreshadows its own future and fate. All words and thinking lead to the child, to that vast immortality and the wide sweep of infinite possibility which the child represents. The political world inhabited by the native, African descendant, and even white children at the turn of the 20th century had already foreshadowed the intransigence of systematic racial oppression down through the century, the scattered seeds of a different sort. One of the chief places of their locality was education. Therefore, Du Bois spoke from the world of prophecy, situating children at the intersection of education's liberatory inevitability, national priority, ethical choice, and a future free of present-day calamity. Have we any right to make human souls face what we face today, he asked. Not trusting that his reader perceived the weight of the question, he continued, the answer is clear. If the great battle of human right against poverty, against disease, against color prejudice is to be won, it must be won not in our day, but in the day of our children's children. Ours is the blood and dust of battle. Theirs the reward of victory. As the voice of the prophetic, Du Bois offered a glimpse into a profound lack of will, marking the fundamentals of social life. But as professor, he provided future generations with one hell of a homework assignment. The reference to war, the blood and dust of battle, is no surprise, coming as this essay did in the wake of the First World War. The black and brown children of immortality of whom Du Bois spoke were sufferers twice over, at least. Born of a climate defined by militarism, the doctor repurposes war as a metaphor for the battlefield of education, of social custom and classroom instruction. Inevitably, he warned, the day will dawn when the mother must explain gently but clearly why the little girls next door do not want to play with the black thing, what the real cause is of the teacher's unsympathetic attitude, and how people may ride in the backs of streetcars and the smoker end of trains and still be people. Black children, therefore, are born in a context of war. Moreover, it is telling that Du Bois called this form of learning caste education, which can be read in at least two ways. People educated as a caste, i.e. you are black, brown immigrant, black, poor, therefore you get X, Y, and Z. Or secondly, that very social positioning is itself a lesson in social dislocation. We might call that disenfranchisement at the level of instruction. Du Bois understood far more than many that the ultimate effect of a diseased educational outlook, the maintenance of social hierarchy, and debasement. Above all, he writes, we must not forget that the object of all education is the child itself and not what it does or makes. With these words, Du Bois retraces a topic he is perhaps most known for when he reminds his reader there has arisen amongst us a movement to make the public school primarily the handmaiden of production. There has risen amongst us a movement to make the public school primarily the handmaiden of production. But since we're in creative space, I want to flip that just a little bit, remix it, throw a little syrup on it, and read it thusly. There has arisen amongst us a movement to make the public school primarily the handmaiden of prison. Though this may seem a stretch, an incipient critique of the so-called school-to-prison pipeline might be found a few paragraphs later when Du Bois drops this query on the reader. What is the least sum that will keep the average youth out of jail? Warfare indeed. Du Bois's questioning of society's commitment to education proceeds to ask, was it inevitable that education and incarceration and war be lifelong associates? What is the nature of such gathering? Furthermore, what would it mean if education claimed the bulk of our social, political, cultural, and economic priorities? Dead-end war investments might be instead put towards building, quote, the most efficient, sanitary, and beautiful schoolhouses the world knows, and space in college could be made for all who want to go. Of course, we would need to protect more faculty lines, especially in Africana studies and critical ed. I just thought I'd add that in there. But the denial of an expansive educational program and philosophy for black youth represents for Du Bois one of the chief expressions of racist thinking, reflected not only in the dull sense of education, but is further retarded by its ties to capitalism. And here he is again. We sin because our befuddled brains have linked money and education inextricably. We assume that only the wealthy have a right to education when in fact being born is being given a right to college training. Our wealth today, we all know, is distributed mainly by chance inheritance and personal favor, and yet we attempt to base the right to education on this foundation. The result is grotesque. We bury genius, we send it to jail, we ridicule and mock it, while we send mediocrity and idiocy to college, gilded and crowned. Years later, in a letter to Harriet Shivery, an aspiring teacher in Meridian, Mississippi, he encouraged, your real duty is, of course, to the children, and they are entirely deserving. You ought to put your whole life and energy in stirring them out of their lethargy and carelessness and make them go off to school and continue their education. Though we can view prophecy in these statements, we return to Bogues' second frame of radical rupture, that of heresy. Du Bois' indictment of America's retreat from education was heretical to the social status quo. Thus, this is clearly what is at play in his single-handedly torturing, intellectual beatdown, and epistemic earthquake beneath the edifice of the U.S. historical establishment, disguised as an essay called The Propaganda of History. For me, this essay forms a curriculum, a mapping through the narrow halls of racist historiography, masking as knowledge about formerly enslaved, come legally disenfranchised, turned irrelevant, if not killed, black bodies. As curriculum, it reveals the anti-knowledge of some well-regarded Reconstruction historians of his day and the anti-intellectualism that pervaded the historical establishment. Writing in 1935, Du Bois offers this: consequently, historians of Reconstruction, with few exceptions, ignored the Negro as completely as possible, leaving the reader wondering why an element so apparently insignificant filled the whole Southern picture at the time. The only real excuse for this attitude is loyalty to a lost cause. reverence for the brave fathers and suffering mothers and sisters, fidelity to the ideas of clan and class. Now check this last piece. But in propaganda against the Negro since emancipation in this land, we face one of the most stupendous efforts the world ever saw to discredit human beings, an effort involving universities, history, science, social life, and religion. This is where, you're free to strike that Ali pose, because, he just killed the whole historical establishment is like shredded in a couple of lines. Oh, man. Anyway, it is for these reasons why it's absolutely mind-boggling that Du Bois's contributions to education and society continue to go ignored. By way of an example, in the third edition of Alexander Rosenberg's Philosophy of Social Science, published in 2008, the doctor has yet to stop traffic, garnering not a single reference, footnote, or otherwise acknowledgement. Perhaps we made more out of the doctor than he deserves. Perhaps his marshaling of facts, his ruthless appetite for erudition, and his disciplinary disruption are mere dots on a vast constellation of ideas. Yawn as some might at his intellectual radicalism, the doctor laid a foundational blueprint for critical ethnic studies, social justice education, with Africana history and social knowledge at the very core. His work constitutes both intellectual investigation and excavation. Alas, we find Du Bois somewhere between the very definition of education and democratic praxis as both student and master of social knowledge. Wisdom is the principal thing, he reminded his reader. Therefore, get wisdom. Thank you.
I was asked, I thought, to kind of theorize about what Du Bois would be saying about education today. And therefore I want to reframe the question in terms, the issue in terms of what is the difference between Du Bois's time and ours. In this book, which is his book, The Education of Black People, 1906 to 1960, 7 of these chapters about black schools and Negro education. But what he says is that his hope that education should be directed to the youth, and that the youth, that so far as, as the race can afford it, we must give our youth training designed above all to make them men of power, of trained and cultivated taste, men who know whither civilization goes and what it means. And that's what I think is missing today. What is today's civilization, and what does it mean? And what is America today? What is it indeed? Education, in my judgment, given the crisis of the times, must be first of all political. Because the problem is, how does one decipher the truth, which is always Du Bois's bellwether, the search for the truth. How does one find the truth in a society in which 40% of the American people get their information from Fox News, in which 5 corporations control the media, in which you are told lies, propaganda, and news is censored? When is the last time you saw coverage in the television about what is happening in Kabul, in Afghanistan, or the civil war that is going on in Iraq, or our great ally in the Middle East? When was the last time you saw television coverage of Jerusalem, not to mention the West Bank and Gaza? I happen to have been in the military in my youth, and so I'm still in touch with dudes in the Corps. And they tell me something I found highly amusing and highly illustrative. The U.S. Embassy in Kabul, there's a tunnel between the East and the West wings because they are afraid to walk upright from one side of the embassy to the other. They must go this tunnel, just like the Palestinians have the tunnel from Egypt into Israel, so that the failure of the policy is manifest to everyone who is involved in Afghanistan, which is why you have 22 suicides a day in the military, That has creeped out to a little publicity, except even that number is false because it doesn't take into consideration vets who are no longer who are no longer on tour. So we are being propagandized. Education, then, must be, above all, a search for the truth, because only with the truth can we hope to affect change. Reality is what reality is. Our responsibility, if Du Bois were here, would be to try and uncover reality so that we can move forward and perhaps save our bacon, as it used to be said. I think the time is especially propitious this evening because hovering all around us is what is happening in the Philippines, the unprecedented typhoon. There was another one last year. Again, you know nothing about what is going on in the South China Sea, in the Maldives, what is going on in the Himalayas, what is going on in Africa, because the right-wing billionaires have funded this false debate about climate change, although every event that happens is unprecedented, which, according to my logic, means it is new and it has never occurred before. What then do we do? Chris mentioned a quote of Du Bois about lunatics, mediocrity, and idiocy. We are in the hands of lunatics. We are in the hands of idiots. We are in the hands of people whose stupidity challenges understanding. Reagan wanted to abolish the Department of Education. He also boasted he never got higher than a C+ when he was in college in Eureka. Gerald Ford, of whom it was said he could not walk and chew gum at the same time. He was also an FBI informant. He was also one of the people who fabricated the Warren Commission report, Gerald Ford. I happen to have gone to Harvard, and I wanted to expend a great deal of money to find out who wrote George Bush's papers when he was in the Harvard Business School, because quite obviously George could not have written them. And that conclusion was verified for me when I was in Paris 8 years ago and Bush was giving a talk on the White House lawn. And the microphone messed up, so you could hear someone telling him what to say. So when I came back to the States, I asked people, what was the reaction to Bush having been exposed? And they said they had heard nothing about it. They had heard nothing about it. So that seems to me to be the challenge, because what we are dealing with are people who are immoral and unscrupulous. The hegemony of the day is privatization. When Chris talks about the faculty, you have the movement for online education, which means you won't need faculty anymore. Corporations will hire people, and students will sit eating sandwiches at home. The corporations will write the manuals, and there will no longer be a need for university. They have privatized everything. Bush privatized 25% of the IRS, of which you are oblivious. They privatized the prisons. There are more private military contractors in Afghanistan than there are troops. And now they are scheming they want to privatize Medicare and Social Security, and they're scheming to privatize the Postal Service. And they did it with the most outlandish and diabolical policies ever. They sneaked in a provision that the Postal Service had to lay aside money for pensions for the next 10 years for their workers. That then undercut their budget so that it had a deficit. That then became their justification for wanting to privatize the Postal Service. You were dealing with the devil's people. That's whom you were dealing with. And the necessity then to confront them the necessity to try and decipher some way above this imbecilic abyss, this immoral and imbecilic abyss, is the challenge of our time. I believe it is the challenge that Du Bois, were he here, would speak to, because as he left the country, at the age of 90, he wrote an autobiography in which he talked about, in which he critiqued America. And the critique that he wrote about in 1958, change a figure here, a name there, is as telling and probing today as it was when he wrote it in 1958. So, what we must do is learn. It will be difficult to decipher the truth, but you must search for the truth. And then once you are confident that you have found it, you must broadcast the truth to as many people as you can, because we need a movement based on truth, because we are inundated by lies, we are inundated by unscrupulousness, we are inundated by hypocrisy and idiocy. C'est bon.
So it's really a pleasure for me to be here with this distinguished group of panelists. This was a wonderful opportunity for me. You know, as a scholar in the field of education, a lot of times we're looking for ways to talk about the current state of education, looking to put forward new ideas on how to ameliorate some of the issues that we see, and having a challenge to re-engage with the work of Du Bois, such an influential thinker. With so much to teach us about the intersections of race and education, really forced me to return to Souls of Black Folk. And I was really moved by some of the rich description, particularly Du Bois' narrative about his own teaching experience. And I think a lot of times we don't think about that. We think about educational philosophers, but we don't necessarily think about the work that they did on the ground. And that rich narrative description about the relationships that he developed in those communities, right, and his fervent belief in the promise of education. So I was struck by many of the concepts in the text, but most notably his notion of the veil and double consciousness. And I kind of, my remarks are going to be a little bit more loose, but I kind of termed them under the unveiling of educational opportunity. And when we think about the notion of the veil, right, Du Bois used it in part to refer to the phenotypic characteristics that differentiate people of color from whites. Expanding on the use of this term, I'd also add that the veil operates outside of the black-white binary that often limits discussions of race to black and white, creating discursive space for other folks who might be multiracial, et cetera. And looks at some of the intersections between race and other variables such as language, socioeconomic class, immigrant status, and others. While it's taken on more subtle and sometimes ambiguous manifestations, the veil nevertheless remains a feature of life for many people of color who are targeted for differential treatment because of their racial or ethnic identities. And we can see this in schools and in many other places. So I think examples of this differential treatment abound. Some are obvious, others more subtle. So take, for example, the differential responses in the loss of life as a result of gun violence. Certainly the tragedies of Newtown, Connecticut, Columbine, Colorado, Jonesboro, Arkansas, Paducah, Kentucky, Virginia Tech, and too many other communities should be a cause for alarm, outrage, concern, and response. These events have certainly sparked an increase in awareness and perhaps even motivation to develop strategies to curb future incidents of school violence. Interestingly, the majority of large-scale school-based violence has occurred in predominantly white, middle, and upper-class suburban and rural communities. And we should be concerned and committed to making all schools safe places for students to grow academically and personally. On the other side of the veil, youth of color in urban communities have also fallen victim to large-scale violence, generally speaking, and gun violence more specifically. More than 2,000 residents of Chicago are shot every year, right? Their murder rate this year is already over 600. Detroit's murder rate is 10 times the national average. Right? If you take San Juan, Puerto Rico is actually in the top 50 for most violent cities in the world. Locally, Springfield and Holyoke both rank as in the top 100 violent cities in America. If Jeff Duncan Andrade actually talks about LA Unified and compares it to a war zone. So a war zone is defined by a certain number of violent deaths that happen within a calendar period in a particular geographic location. If you took LA Unified School District, it would actually, and it was his own country, it would actually qualify for United Nations assistance as a war zone. Yet we don't think about young people of color coming up and being educated in a war zone, right? Oftentimes when I work with pre-service teachers, I ask them, if I was gonna put you on a plane and send you to Afghanistan, would your pedagogy have to change? And logically they say, of course, my pedagogy would have to change. And I say, why? Well, those folks are culturally different. They speak a different language, and also, right, there's an ongoing war in those spaces. Well, in many of these communities, right, many of the folks that are working in these communities are as familiar with the sociocultural realities in these communities as they are of Afghanistan, right? And so if we look at many of these examples, you could even see it in the coverage of the recent mall shooting where a man opened fire in a mall in New Jersey, only killing himself, and that caught national attention. Well, recently there was a mass murder in Detroit in a barbershop, which has received very little attention. And so you can see the responses to violence in these communities hasn't been as swift or far-reaching. In my opinion, the loss of life in urban communities of color has not generated the national outcry and commitment to action that the loss of life in suburban America has. Perhaps the differential response suggests that as a nation, we continue to be shielded by the veil that Du Bois references. Du Bois's notion of the veil and double consciousness also speak to the impact of internalized oppression, or what Frantz Fanon referred to as the epidermalization of inferiority, or on the ways that many people of color view themselves. So if we think about the educational experiences that many students of color have, they oftentimes languish in schools where their cultural and linguistic identities are ignored, or even worse, maligned. Many students go through schools without ever learning about the communities with which they identify or engaging with diverse bodies of literature. For many urban youth of color, schooling is tantamount to test prep pedagogy, where getting students to pass standardized tests takes precedence over engaging in a multicultural education that seeks to provide them with the knowledge and skills they need, not only for social mobility, but also to change the world. The new Common Core standards, for example, speak to creating global citizens, but do not include any references to bilingual or multicultural education. As a result of educational neglect, students develop a negative appraisal of their academic capabilities. And so, this to me was most salient in recent work that I did with a group of Latino students. And so I worked with a group of Latino students, teaching them how to do research and then putting them on a research team with me to come up with some remedies to address the crisis in Latino education that's happening across the country. And the first day I was there, I was going on about all the wonderful things I thought we could do, all of the possibility associated with this project, and I saw that I was losing one of the students. I'm losing some of you too, so, but losing one of the students. And she kind of just interjected in the middle. And I stopped and I said, what's wrong? And she kind of with the head nodding and the whole bit, right, sucking the teeth. She was like, we're not smart. And I kind of blew her off. I was like, you passed smart years ago. You're brilliant. Don't ever let someone tell you you're not smart. Get back to the PowerPoint, right? Because that's where I feel comfortable. And so that's about me. But 30 seconds later, she jumps in again, screams out, Latinos are not smart. And the entire class of 24 Latino students comes to her defense to convince me, a Latino with a doctorate, that Latinos are intellectually inferior to white folks. Right? This is 2008, 2009. Think about how strongly you must hold on to a belief where in the face of something that actually challenges that stereotype, you assert your own intellectual inferiority, right? And so I think this notion is perhaps best captured in the words of Carter G. Woodson in his book, Miseducation of the Negro, which was published about 3 decades after Souls of Black Folk. He wrote, if you can control a man's thinking, you do not have to worry about controlling his action. When you determine what a man shall think, you do not have to concern yourself about what he will do. If you make a man feel that he is inferior, you do not have to compel him to accept an inferior status, for he will seek it himself. If you make a man think that he is justly an outcast, you do not have to order him to the back door. He will go without being told, and if there is no back door, his very nature will demand one. Clearly, right now, we know that young people are experiencing a significant amount of academic neglect and not experience the type of academic success that we would hope. And we could kind of ask why, right? Why is this the case? So I'll just put a question out to the audience. So this is the interactive portion of the program. How many of you think urban schools that serve large percentages of students of color, large percentages of low-income students, how many of you think those schools are not working well? Show of hands. How many of you think they are working well? So I disagree with most of you. I actually think they're working perfectly well. They do exactly what they were designed to do, and that is reproduce race and class-based stratification. I'll say it again. They're doing exactly what they were designed to do, and that is reproduce race and class-based stratification. And so when we think about the educational experiences offered to young people in low-income communities and communities of color, right, oftentimes it's, as I described, a test prep pedagogy, getting them to pass the test, but not really helping them develop the skills that they need to actually change the world, right, to confront what Paulo Freire refers to as those limit situations, right? Bowles and Gintis forwarded this notion here at UMass in the 70s around social reproduction theory, borrowing from Bourdieu. Right, I'll give you another example of how this veil kind of masks the ways that we even think about young people of color. So right now there's a big discrepancy in test scores between students of color and white folks, yes? What do we call that? The what gap? The achievement gap, right? And this is common parlance in education. We talk about the achievement gap, and people are coming from a really good place about closing the achievement gap without thinking about the ways that that term actually reinscribes whiteness. Right, so we're saying, here's one more way that students of color don't match up to their white counterparts, normalizing the experience of white students and pathologizing the experiences of students of color. It also completely mystifies educational opportunity, and I think that needs to be unveiled. Right, so for many young people in our state, in our nation, right, through accident of birth, if you happen to go to a school, right, that doesn't come from, is not in a community that has a ton of economic resources, right, you don't have the same educational opportunities that other people through accident of birth, born in more affluent communities have. And so by focusing solely on achievement without lifting the veil on opportunity really mystifies the entire process, and it's not going to help us move toward a more equitable educational system. So for me, kind of just summing up how I think Du Bois's work really plays out in schools, I think what communities of color are asking for is educational sovereignty, right? Who has the right to kind of control what gets taught, how it gets taught, what the curriculum looks like in particular communities? Now, oftentimes when we think about school reform, it's top down, right? Most often created by folks who are very disconnected from those communities. And so really, I think what Du Bois's work speaks to us is to join with communities of color, to join with young people in solidarity, to reclaim that right to an education and make it one that's multicultural, that makes it one that is connected to the lived experience and material conditions in which students of color are embedded. So I'll just leave it there, and hopefully we can have some more conversation.
I heard you float the question with a heavy head that echoed my own, what is to be done? I frame it in its more traditional way, but that is what you said. And some of that has been gestured towards by the remarks that I've heard. But contextualizing this in the vivid image of being held in the demonic palm, I might say sociopathic palm, of those who hold so much power in our country, in our world, what is to be done?
I think the possibility exists if I just came back from Washington. I had a talk with some people in the Congressional Black Caucus, because the Republican Party needs to be exposed, and the Democrats have refused to do it. But Obama's election, let me say, the Republican Party is a racist party. Its hegemony has been achieved by racism. They put together a strategy in 1955 called Operation Dixie, in which their aim was to compete with the Dixiecrats for the 11 states of the Confederacy. They were interested in the 11 states of the Confederacy because we have 435 congresspersons and 100 senators. That's 535. To be elected president of the United States, you need 270 electoral votes. The 11 states of the Confederacy represent 60% of the 270 votes. The success of their strategy has resulted in the fact, which you will not believe. Since 1964, no Democratic presidential candidate has won a majority of the white vote. For 50 years, they have played racism to the hilt. But you cannot, but there's no evil in America. You cannot call white people racist. What they call them, a racist is a social conservative, you see. A Wall Street lackey is a fiscal conservative. And nobody will say fascism. Americans, as I was saying to Danya earlier, it's that movie of a few good men where Jack Nicholson tells Tom Cruise the truth, you can't handle the truth. But what's possible, Obama won with 39% of the white vote in 2008 and 43% in 2012. That is to say, he won with the votes of blacks, Latinos, Asian Americans, and young whites. He won with Jesse's Rainbow Coalition. That force, at least theoretically, has the possibility of being organized. But it needs to be organized not just to French kiss Obama. It needs to be organized with an analysis of how do you structurally change this society?
Right.
How do you structurally change it? How do you take money out of the society? In more civilized countries, they vote on Sunday, so there's no competition on the vote. But even with the most brazen theft of Bush's elections, nobody said squat. See? You may remember people standing in long lines to vote because they did not send voting machines to black and Democratic districts. The Republican districts had a zillion machines. The cops harassed people in Florida. The NAACP sent me to Florida in 2000, and we found votes that had not been counted in 2 hotel rooms in Florida. The press, of course, says nothing. It was brazen, unbelievably brazen, and yet people will not say that kind of sickness, that kind of evil represents, to a very large extent, the political system of today. So we need someone who will rally these forces that are out there. And there's another problem when Compañero was talking about urban youth. Blacks and whites today are ahistorical. You didn't have to educate black people to America in the old days because we were mostly a Southern people. I remember going to Macon, Georgia to visit my grandparents. Actually, they lived in a little town, which is another story outside of Macon, and seeing in the structural building colored and white. And when we got on the train in Washington, D.C., you had to get on a segregated train. The black youth of today don't know that. They're not reading. Nobody is reading. They're not even reading Huckleberry Finn. They're not reading Louisa May Alcott. They're not reading Tom Sawyer. They're not reading Robin Hood. They're not reading squat. But you see them every day with the little boom, 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 little iPhones. So we never had to educate black people to racism before. Now we need to do it. We need to educate them to what America is. And when I say you need to learn, America is an empire, blood. We have 900 military bases around the world. And they exist solely to advance the interests of the mega corporations. There's no such thing as an American corporation anymore. When Obama talks about the creating jobs, they've exported 800,000 jobs last year. And they exported them to people like Bangladesh where the monthly wage is $38 a month. They're now striking so they can maybe raise it to $64 a month. But they're striking in Cambodia. They're striking everywhere for your Walmarts and your Gap and your Nike. and your Nikes. So there are no jobs for Americans. And the other potential revolutionary thing, black people are now irrelevant to the American economy, but so are increasing numbers of white people. They don't need white people any longer either. So the potential for political mobilization, if the truth can be communicated to enough people, is what we used to be taught in Sunday school. Let those who have eyes to see, see, and those with ears to hear, hear.
My name is Nat Turner. I'm also a professor in the College of Education, and I'm going to just try and play discussant for a moment with the themes of you three. But I heard Strix talk about broadcasting the truth. That's what we need to be doing. I heard Jason talk, actually I already know Chris with Trigger Radio and Rec every Friday, WMUA 91.1 are broadcasting the truth in a very organized and clear manner, using the aesthetics of hip hop and all that. And then I heard Jason talking about he works with youth on research, and I know he also does some media production. So I'm asking you three on the panel here with all of that knowledge and resources. And then we also have about 50 Springfield teachers in social studies and history education in the room, okay? So I'm asking this room of intelligence and power and brilliance, can we envision together a project here in Springfield and Holyoke, don't leave Holyoke out, where we're working with youth around this work? And so I just throw it out.
I think, and you and I have talked about this a little bit. I think for many communities of color, they're disconnected from their own histories. And if, I always, when I try to make a convincing argument to folks, right, because I know teachers work under a lot of constraints, I go back to basic learning theory, right? Kids learn best when you build on what they already know. And so really connecting young people to their own cultural histories and histories around place. And I think many of the young people that I work with, and obviously I haven't surveyed all of Springfield or all of Holyoke, but many of those young people have very little understanding about how their families actually came to these regions. And those struggles are significant. And what have been those experiences in school? And so oftentimes they see themselves disconnected from this larger history. And I think that narrative is really problematic. And most of us are unfamiliar with these narratives. But if we go into schools, oftentimes many of the youth are talked about in these deficit perspectives, all the things that they lack as opposed to the assets. And I get all the time that young people, particularly young people of color, are apathetic about education. And I struggle with that, because if we look historically, African Americans, fought for literacy when it was punishable by death, right? Literally, people would give their lives to become literate, right? That story doesn't get told. Latinos are seen as apathetic about education, and they were pioneers in the school desegregation movement, right? So when Brown versus Board of Ed came out in '54, Thurgood Marshall used precedents in the Latino community to argue that case. And interestingly, Latinos weren't covered under Brown until 1974. And so many people are unaware with those, of those histories. So I would like to see this kind of grassroots, local histories of what's going on and connecting those to folks' points of origin, wherever those might be in the diaspora.
How many of y'all remember the Dream Defenders? How many people heard of the Dream Defenders? That's not my students, because we started with this in the beginning of the semester. Dream Defenders, nobody? This actually speaks to Professor Strickland's point about how we access news. The reason why I mentioned Dream Defenders was because this was the Florida group, mostly students and young people, who occupied the state capitol for over a month, 31 days. And what they were calling for, built on tradition of direct action and educational demand, and really positioning education as a social movement, continuing in that tradition. I don't think that we teach that enough at the public school level. I was lucky when I was coming up in California, Los Angeles. I had a history teacher, Japanese American, who I didn't know at the time, but when I went to college, I found out that he was part of the ethnic studies movement to get ethnic studies into the colleges at Cal Berkeley, UCLA, Cal States, and he was part of that. So what he did for our history class, and again, I knew this after the fact, 1992, he was able to take the textbook out of the class. And he taught us, Japanese American, he taught us the autobiography of Malcolm X and Frederick Douglass. narrative. But what's the incentive for teachers to do that kind of creative stuff right now? With all this hyper testing, hyper scrutiny of principals even by the district, stranglehold on creativity in the classroom. That's the result. So the reason why I bring up the Dream Defenders is because they're talking about ending the school-to-prison pipeline, passing Trayvon's law, which basically is an abolition of the stand your ground law in Florida, and an end to racial surveillance of black and brown bodies just throughout the state of Florida. Those are their three demands. Those are progressive demands. Those are demands that we could build educational platforms around. Yet, people outside of Florida don't know that it's going on. So part of it, we got to take some responsibility for looking at news more critically and ferreting out the news that speaks to social justice on a regular basis. And no, if you start your morning with Amy Goodman and some coffee, that ain't enough. Sorry, I like Amy too.
Al Jazeera too.
Al Jazeera, however you want us to, it's not enough. So we almost have to be activists from wherever our position is, whether we're principals, whether we're teachers, counselors. How can we have activists, social justice-minded high school counselors, right? We just opened up a new school. I didn't, but they just opened up a new school in Holyoke, Paulo Freire School. So they're just kind of experimenting with a new model that not just critiques the old model of public education, but really puts forth a future vision of a less punitive educational experience for the kids who are really adversely affected by the pre-existing problems in public schools. So, but this is a charter school, this is a small school, but they, trying to employ social justice principles. That has to be part of our daily work. And I'm not sure that everybody can say that is. How many teachers even throughout the state sent letters of solidarity to the Chicago teachers who were shutting down downtown just a few months ago, right? How are we building solidarity even amongst our professional ranks? That has been beat out of us as well. So somebody has to be willing to lose something in order to gain some traction towards real, substantial, and measurable social change. But other than that, I don't understand, how we can move forward with just these ideas. And so my whole thing is to position Du Bois, at the heart of all these struggles. How much can we even teach Du Bois and his, arguments and ideas in our classrooms? Can we do that? We might appreciate him from afar, from across the street. But the point is how can we live through Du Bois in an educational vein? And for me, I think that's the top priority. And yeah, teaching at the college level is a little bit different. So maybe once I get tenure, I'll spend my sabbatical year at the high school. I could join y'all. You know what I'm saying? It's all good. I'm with it. And in the Africana Studies tradition, I like to say that, look, I should be able to have something for 5-year-olds and 55-year-olds. As educators, if I walk into a room and the audience is diverse in age, I need to be able to connect with folk. The other piece, too, around this question of Trayvon's law, stop and frisk, New York City, racial profiling, all this kind of stuff, and Dream Defenders, is the fact of the carceral state or the prison industrial complex. How are we making sure that our schools aren't complicit in funneling our students through zero tolerance policies, through suspensions, but also through more minor disciplinary conditioning, such as, if you talk out of turn, stand in the hallway for the duration of the class. Or if you do end up in a physical altercation, we're gonna make sure that the whole school sees you in handcuffs and you're 10 years old. There's a study that came out from a professor at Princeton and a professor at UVA, University of Virginia, that said the more negative interactions you have with police in urban communities, it has a direct impact on your civic engagement. So if you're 12 years old, you're getting busted up by the police. You 16 years old, you're getting busted up by the police. You seeing raids on your block. You seeing family members and church members going off in handcuffs. When you see that, by the time you're eligible to vote, you've already checked out. But yet being registered it will get you onto juries, right? Will get you civically engaged, thinking of different things, applying for grants, trying to bring creative ideas to your community. That stuff is being systematically taken from our youth, and we're not noticing it, and we're not identifying it and confronting it where it's at. So those three things for me bring together, these questions around what we do as educators and the social world, and as I mentioned in the talk, the social education that many of our youth are getting that's coming outside of the classroom, right? They're getting educated by police presence, by disciplinary infractions, by zero tolerance policies. And I don't want to be completely dystopian real quick. There are many local organizations throughout the country who are actively pushing against these regimes. But unless we support them with both dollars, communication, and letters of support, letting people know that we're watching and that we're in support and that we're trying to do those same things at home, then it all goes for naught. And Fox News wins. There you go.
For all three panelists, what would you recommend to us for media resources? How should we inform ourselves? What do you rely on most to find out what's going on?
I read the New York Times and the Boston Globe every day. I get up and I listen to NPR. NPR in the morning is quite informative. I watch Al Jazeera. And I also read Le Monde or the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. Which I also recommend, even if you don't have a foreign language, just read The Guardian, read a British newspaper, because to be abroad and see how the rest of the world is viewing America, and I ask my students the same thing. I have them read. It's miraculous what they will learn in 14 weeks, to see the stories that are covered abroad that are not covered here, what the headlines are here as opposed to abroad, the emphases, how much different it is, and especially how the rest of the world is now viewing America. We just got kicked out of the UNESCO, do you know that? We got kicked out of UNESCO.
Well, we stopped paying dues first.
They finally wised up, yes. But the rest of the world wants to know what is wrong with America. And Americans don't want to face the fact that they are no longer respected. America is no longer respected in the world. But the problem is to understand the system. We are facing a system, and it is intricate and multi-level. So when Chris talks about the prison industrial complex, they have the drug war. 80% of the people in the joint are black and Latino. They passed these laws to keep them in as long as possible, because the Republicans are the corporations for the prisons. So you put the Bloods in the joint, and then you take away their vote when they come out as well. You see, and they do, and they have all of these multi-level goodies which accrue to them. When you ask what needs to be done, one of the most difficult things to face is jobs. Is jobs. We can talk all the history we want, but if a young brother or sister can make more money, even as a lookout, than his or her daddy can make driving a damn bus, what are you going to do? Especially when your experience in the school is unsatisfactory. So you go out on the street. Now you either can join the military, you can do the drug thing, or you can take one of these low-paying non-union jobs. And you see the low-paid workers striking all over the country now. But you cannot live on, when I say the system, they stay up 28 hours a day scheming. 28 hours a day. See? Which is what they're doing now. When they look to see how they lost the last election, they want to eliminate Sunday votes. Students will not be able to vote on campus. They raised all this, I almost said a bad word, non-existent voter fraud. And the media they just say, and the media just repeats it like it's real. In Florida, there have been 2 cases of voting fraud alleged in the last 75 years. 2. But now it's a whole national calamity, placing in their hands the right to have a government ID card, which they determine is legal or not. And then they may say you need 2. So you go in to vote and some cracker says to you, no, you can't vote. Right? Or you do vote. When I said I was in Florida, you had in 2000, they moved the voting precinct. See? So where you voted in September, you go to vote in November and it is no longer there. And then you call the registrar's office and the line is busy and you cannot get through. I mean, these are the devil's people, Jack. But the stuff that they do is just mind-blowing. And how they seal up every possible corner and they're scheming day and night. How then do we get jobs? The only way we can get jobs to the degree that they're necessary is they must come from the government. We need another new deal. And but all you hear about is the deficit and the debt. America is now the greatest debtor nation in the history of the world. We owe $17 trillion. The debt is approximately $800 billion. And this is the consequence of their ignorance, because they've destroyed unions. Only 7% of public sector is unionized, 5% of the private sector. They embrace austerity, so they cut back public service so that the people who contribute 80% to the budget lose their jobs, so the taxes go down, so the debt increases. So therefore they must borrow. That's why there's all this commotion about increasing the debt limit. They must increase because corporations do not pay taxes. You, each and every one of you, paid more than General Electric last year. In 2010, ExxonMobil made $32 billion in profit and got $5 billion in subsidies. It is not our government, it is their government, and they care not about us at all. I mean, when they have the cojones, perdone, they want to cut $40 billion from food stamps. So let you die on the street, Jack. And nobody says it's racist. Their policies are aimed at a particular segment of the population. The bank loans were predatory loans aimed at black and brown people. But how the system works, how its racist character is manifesting itself, is not being discussed. And even when you try and put it together, it takes a lot of research just to see all the ramifications of the devil's work. So we need to organize ourselves to demand that money be taken out of politics, that jobs stop being outsourced, or if they are going to be outsourced, government money, as in the New Deal, must go for new energy, for renewables, and for jobs. The infrastructure in this country, $2 trillion. So you're driving along happily, the damn bridge collapses under you, Jack. See? $2 trillion to fix the infrastructure of this country. But none of these realities are being communicated to the people. Just go watch American Idol or drink bad wine. because America is the best of all possible worlds. Your mama, it is.
I am from Chicago, and I was really interested when you were talking about gang violence and in Chicago. And in Chicago, it's a common thing now for the youth to call Chicago Chirac. There's this statistic that goes around all the time that more young men of color were killed in Chicago than soldiers in Afghanistan in 2012. I have no idea if that's true, but that's just a common thing that I've heard. And when I've mentioned this to people, they get really affronted and kind of shocked. And I'm just wondering, how do we make the comparison to a war zone in a way that's really effective and will actually get people to think about it and not just like shut them down?
So I would argue communities of color are typically positioned as in two ways: pathological and in need of being controlled, or in need of being saved, right? And I think we have to kind of disrupt that narrative and talk about young people's lives having value no matter where they are. But I want to connect that back to schools, because if we've seen the surge in violence, in part is connected to a lot of school closings. So we know that in Chicago, right, young people are connected geographically, oftentimes creating these, these geographic boundaries, gang boundaries in particular, and they cut schools, particularly in African American communities, right, and close those schools, privatizing them, reopening them as charters, but then forcing those young people to cross lines that are dangerous, knowing that they were dangerous. And so this uptick in violence, right, it's always been an issue, but this uptick in violence, I think, has a lot to do with many of the policies that are going on in education, right, and unfortunately, I don't think a lot of this is random, right. I'm not that smart. Right? You can figure this stuff out if you just kind of connect the dots. And so I think first and foremost, we need to have an honest conversation about valuing all young people's lives, right? Wherever this might happen. We talked briefly about the school to prison pipeline. So, think about the tragedy in Columbine, and it was a tragedy, right? So since that happened, they've put tons of social services in that school. Even though all the young people that experienced that directly, right, are no longer in that school, they still have social services in there, understanding that was a huge tragedy. Think about the tragedies in our community and the trauma that young people endure, and where are the services to support those young people in schools, right? We don't think about it. We're kind of like, just check all that stuff at the door because we got to get to math. And I think we have to, if we're not willing to really acknowledge, honor, and support what young people bring to school, then we're a morally bankrupt institution. Right? And I think that's kind of where we are in terms of education. So I think education could be the vehicle through which we expose some of this stuff, and it could also be the vehicle through which we do some healing around some of this stuff as well. But that's a great question.
How many people have seen 12 Years of a Slave? Go see it again. That's the history. I think one of the things that the schools need to do is to teach our history. They need to teach the history. And when I was growing up, we were taught that education was part of the struggle. We were taught we had to be twice as good as white people. I'm sure Randolph taught you that, my brother. But that same kind of initiative, that same kind of context is missing today. So people need to understand the history. It's not the answer, but I think it's part of the answer against this gang. It's only when you don't value yourself or others that you murder. If you understood, but the culture has changed, and I've been talking about this with some of my comrades around the country. I can walk across campus and run into a black student who will purposely avoid looking at me. That is unprecedented in our history. In our history, it was always, hey baby, what's happening? Or wherever you were in the world, you saw a black person with, yo baby. Now, I emailed friends in about 7 other campuses, and they said the same thing, where these black students, well, Negro students, purposely avoid looking at you. So there's the solidarity that once existed is not there anymore. No sé si es lo mismo con Latinos, pero no sé. Igual. So we have a lot of work to do, and we're facing, I don't want to be pessimistic, but one of my mentors once said, just because our cause is just does not mean we will triumph. That's what started me drinking, actually.
That's another night.
Yeah,
Hello. Hello. My name is Nicholas. I received my public school education for elementary school in Brooklyn and my high school education for public school in Norfolk, Virginia. While I was in Norfolk, I experienced that the school board of the city had a great focus on creating, as you said, like global citizens with absolutely no emphasis on essentially non-Eurocentric cultures and history. And while in public school, this particular public school, I witnessed a lot of gun violence. In a fairly wealthy suburban community, I witnessed a lot of gun violence, a lot of students being taken out of school in handcuffs. And while it didn't necessarily affect me personally in the sense that I was still driven to attain my own education, I realized that how it affected a lot of my personal friends and a lot of my close family who had grown up in the South long before I had been there. I started to wonder to myself, how can students who are still involved in their community, I am currently attending college in Norfolk, but I still have a lot of friends who are going to this same high school and experiencing the same kind of violence and seeing these tragedies every day. I was wondering, what advice would you give to people who want to immediately affect their communities, who, like people who are as young as me, who can find the time to go out and to disseminate information in new ways? What would you say to me if I were to tell you that I wanted to make sure that people around me knew what was happening in the world?
Do you have a local media station, local radio? You do radio? So I think that's critical. We have to produce our own media. I mean, that's one of the ways that I've strike back. The other thing too is I would say, you know, how much time do you have to invest? Because I think that, and you don't have to answer that, but I'm just thinking that's the question that we all have to address, which is how much time are we willing to commit? And if we are not going to be moving from the community anytime soon, then you could pick anything and just do it long term, whether that's tutoring young folk, some type of mentoring program, building your own educational social justice group, communicating that through the media, and then doing all that all over again. I don't think that there is one magic wand. I don't think that there is one, you know, quick fix scheme that we can employ. We're talking about decades of sedimentation around these questions. They've been settled in, they're beneath the soil, and they respond when new bodies come up and kick those seeds up. And so I think that it's a long-term struggle. Some people in critical social justice ed use the term wraparound model, where you try to address all the aspects that go into a child's learning that are both inside the classroom and outside the classroom in terms of what their parents are dealing with, transportation, social services, where they cash their check, all these kind of what are seemingly mundane or just taken for granted systems. We have to really try to address. All those things affect how people learn in the classroom and how they grow and develop and how they see themselves in the world. So the point is, choose something and do it long term. But it's going to require a tremendous effort. And while you're doing it personally, hopefully you have an infectious organizing style to where you, at every cycle, are bringing in new people and showing them the work that you've been inspired by and that you've been committed to. And it's that deep, long-winded, unapologetic commitment that I think Du Bois models more than anybody that we could really talk about. You're talking about somebody who dedicated 75 years of their public life to one question: social equality. global understanding of humanity. 75 years, right? So the point is that that's the model that we want to be. We don't want to, we can't afford to age out of any of these efforts. It can't just be on a 4-year plan. Oh, I was radical in college, but then when I graduated, I needed to start paying bills. Well, yeah, you got to pay bills, but you should also stay connected to those things that you help create and those things that you're trying to help reverse. And I think that for me, there's no magic wand. That's the work that I do. I try to model that. You know, even with my teaching, I don't leave my teaching in the college classroom. It always goes back out into the community, and I'm always reaching out to the community for new ideas and new ways to teach different things. And that's a reflexive process, you know, and it's a long-term process. But the other part, too, going back to an earlier point that I made about incentives, when we teach at the college level, most of our stuff is around, you know, job security. So therefore, we have to publish, we have to be active citizens, we have to support our colleagues, we have to do other things. And sometimes that takes us away from doing the work that we really want to be doing, you know, like social justice work. Sometimes that's not rewarded in the systems of education that we work in. You know, so how can we bring pressure to bear on those systems to start to appreciate the full diversity of our active public life? And the more that we can do that, you're going to create more spaces for incentives so that teachers aren't just burnt out after those 6 periods, that they still feel that they have some purpose, that they can have the energy to go to a meeting, that they can create space maybe on the weekend to do something extra. But for me, the last point I want to make, and the reason why Du Bois is so important too, it's not just activity. He's radical. We can't be afraid of radicalism. We can't be afraid of ideas that emanate from the left that challenge the social status quo, right? But the first thing, we have to familiarize ourselves with the demands coming out of those left spaces and why they're critiquing social structures, educational structures, economic structures, political structures in a particular way. But that has been beat out of us too, so everybody's scared to be too left. But too left may be what we need to really push things towards the vision that we have, the idea that we're engulfed with. And that piece right there is where Du Bois is unapologetic as well, because the work that's required will make the majority of people uncomfortable. You lose friends when you do that work that's real purposeful. You might not have the same crew. As teachers, we might not have the same people in the lunchroom with us when we find out, oh, you didn't vote for Obama or the Republican candidate? Well, I don't want to talk to you. Instead of seeing that person as a person with principles, with conviction, and that's not, their political desires are not being fed by what the political options are. But we deride that person as being apolitical or crazy or nutty or just too avant-garde, so we hands off. And that has to change, you know, in order for things to really move forward. Otherwise, we're just playing, tinkering with reforms that's not really getting us where we want to go. And it's not reaching the people who could really do broad-based change, like superintendents of education. Just to stay on the education tip. Superintendent. Is your superintendent progressive? Does your superintendent have this book, Education of Black People, Education of Brown People, in their collection, within their reach? Have they read the damn thing? That's the question. The superintendent, this is the person who's defining what education is in the county. These people have to be held account to this knowledge as well. It's not just the students. So that's a long answer. You know, I call that my week 15 answer. You know what I'm saying? This is the last time I'm gonna see my students. Boom, I'm giving them all my ideas, right? But the point is, man, long-winded struggle. If we can all dedicate, you know, our work, rigorous, insightful, creative work, and give that for decades, I think we could see change. But without that, we're just going to be tinkering at the top, looking busy, and nothing's changing.
Let me suggest something.
Oh, there's a question in the back. My bad.
Okay.
And we're running out of time.
You're in Norfolk? You need to get your friends together and analyze how does the political system. There used to be is the Norfolk Journal and Guide still there? Still publishing?
I don't think so.
The Norfolk Journal and Guide, the black newspapers, is still being published? We'll publish something like it. You also go ahead. You need, what is the political system of Norfolk and in Virginia? Democrat just won narrowly in the state of Virginia. What is, when Chris talks about the superintendent of education, how is the city of Norfolk organized politically? And once you do that analysis, you must look for its weak point, and then you must strike. You must organize your folk to strike. Because when we're talking about getting jobs back in the community and we're being responsive to education, it's all government. We must confront government, but we must scare them as well. In the last election, only 43% of black people voted. 43%. You get your folk together, you analyze what's happening, you decide where to strike, and then you register the votes, and then you strike. And if you're not successful in that election, then you do the next thing. You start a recall campaign. One of my boys is saying, well, all we need to do is just recall all the Republicans and everything will be cool, which is an idea that needs further investigation.
On that note, I would like to conclude this conversation. This was very interesting and thought-provoking. We are moving into a much shorter than expected session. First of all, thank you very much for coming tonight. Springfield's teachers are going to stay around a little bit for a book discussion, Souls of Black Folks by Du Bois. Anybody who wants to stay who's not from Springfield is totally welcome to stay as well. How about we reconvene in 5 minutes and continue until 7 o'clock. Thank you so much for coming.